guys, it's Sarah from K7 Farm, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk starting onions from seed with you tonight. Every spring I'm asked a lot of questions about growing onions, and onions, at least for me, have been one of the easiest things to be able to grow. There are some very important parts that you should know about the seed starting process. The first one is making sure you're growing the right variety of onion for your area. If you are searching through a seed catalog, chances are good you're going to be bombarded with terms like long day, short day, intermediate day, or day neutral. Short day onions are grown in the south. Intermediate day or day neutral, those are both the same type of, the same kind of zone, is kind of throughout the middle of the country, and I'll show you a map here in just a second. And then long day variety should be grown in the north. So I printed this from the Johnny's website, and as you can see, up here in Michigan, that's where I'm at, we want a long day onion. And that basically refers to hours of daylight in regards to when the onion starts bulbing. So you want to choose a variety that grows either as a long day or an intermediate day onion for up here in Michigan. Now with the intermediate day onions, you may not get the biggest bulb, but they do tend to grow well. I like to think of that as like the buffer zone between the long day and the short day onion zones. Next thing I'm always asked is, when do I start them? Because onions can be started way ahead of the season, before most anything else. On the back of most seed packets, it'll say start 8 to 10 to 8 to 12 weeks before you intend to set them out. Now, when you hear the words before you intend to set them out, don't get confused with before your last frost date, because more common than anything else on the back of a seed packet, you're going to read before your last frost date. However, onions can actually go out 3 to 4 weeks before our last frost date. In Michigan, that's kind of iffy, because you don't want to transplant if your ground is frozen, covered in snow, or too wet. So 3 to 4 weeks before our last frost, we may not be able to put our onions out. But onions, as long as they are fed and watered and given proper lighting and are in a container that is big enough, are usually pretty happy to hang out extra weeks if need be. So if you add all that up, the 8 to 12 weeks before you intend to set them out, plus the 3 to 4 weeks before your last frost, which is the time period that they can safely be set in the ground, in most cases, that's 16 weeks before your last frost. And right now, for my area, it's right now that you can start those seeds. So if you had the itch to start something and you want to start some seeds, onion seeds are a great way to go about doing so. Now, when you transplant them, chances are good you're going to probably end up with a cold snap that happens. Most onions are hardy down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Then that doesn't mean that they're happy at 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but they will still survive in most cases. But if we do get caught with a cold spell like that, feel free to cover your onions with bed sheets or frost cover. If you use plastic, just make sure that they're not touching the onions, and then plastic would work just fine also. Now, when it comes to what to start them in, which is another very common question that I get, I'm going to share how I do it, just in case any of you want to grow a lot of onions, and then I'm going to share other ways that you can do it if you don't need to start as many onions. I run a farm share program, I sell onions to the public, and I've got a big family and we eat lots of onions and preserve a lot of onions, so I grow thousands of onions. And when I start them in something that is pretty small, size-wise, for each individual cell. This is a 288 plug tray, which means that there are 288 holes in which seedlings can grow. As you can see, the spots are small, and it's not very deep. So I planted here knowing that I will need to pot them up into something bigger sometime soon after they've been started. So in March, I have a hoop house behind my house. It's a 10 by 24. And I put all of my cold weather hardy plants out there. They're not going in the ground, they're going to stay in containers. But that clears up space in my basement greenhouse, which is where I'm at right now. And the reason I start so many in these 288s is simply to be able to start a large number of seedlings at once. And if I started them in something bigger, chances are good that I would probably fill this entire greenhouse with onion seedlings alone. And there's other things I've got started down here. So, and not only that, by the time I set them outside, I will have many other things started down here. So I need to have room for something other than just onions. So come March, I put the cover on my hoop house, and on the really cold nights, I'll throw a radiant heater out there. and keep things comfortable. But when I do put them out there, I will pot them up into a bigger plug tray, which will allow those roots to continue growing and producing a strong, healthy plant over the next month or so that it hangs out in the hoop house before I put them in the ground. Now, if you don't want to deal with potting up, you don't need to start in something that small. You could start in something bigger, especially if you're not growing as many onions as I am. You could do either a 128 plug tray, or you can do the 72 count trays. This is a plug tray, but if you shop at any type of garden center, you are probably familiar with the flat and the 6-packs that fill it. And you are more than welcome to use the 6-packs also. They are very deep and they keep onion seedlings really happy. When I plant my seeds in the plug trays, I will multi-sow them, which means I'm planting 2 to 4 seeds per hole, and I'm letting them grow as a group up until the point that I put them outside. Then I take that whole plug of 2 to 4 seedlings and I put that in the ground, and they grow as a group. And I've never had issues with overcrowding or anything like that. Once one of the group is ready to harvest, I will pull that out, leave the others behind to continue growing, and that way I can have a continuous harvest, but also grow a large number of onions in a small amount of space. So for growing onions, that's a great way to do it. Now, if you want to grow a lot of onions and you want to use the smallest amount of space possible, you could do what I used to do. And it worked out well for me, but I'll tell you why I don't do it anymore in just a minute. You can fill up one of these flats, take out the cell inserts, leave it empty, and then fill it with potting soil. And then take a pack of seeds, just your typical pack. I had one down here somewhere. Anyway, just your typical pack of 300 or so. Here it is. Something like this. I wouldn't use a bulk pack, but Baker Creek is kind enough to tell how many seedlings there are minimum, or not seedlings, but how many seeds there are minimum in their seed packs, and for most of them that I buy, it's a minimum of 300. So you can take this. They're usually pretty generous, so there's usually over 300 in there. But I will take a whole pack like that, broadcast it along the top of my flat, and grow them. When they sprout and grow, it kind of looks like a mat of grass, and they're pretty happy to hang out with each other until it's time to transplant. You will not need to transplant pot up to a bigger container until you are ready to transplant them outside. Having said that, let me just issue this, generalized warning. You watch your plants, and if they look like they are growing out of their container, pot them up into something bigger. Don't not do it because I said you don't need to. I'm just telling you what has worked for me in my growing conditions. And if you end up having onions that grow really, really well, then you may need to pot up even from these bigger trays. So consider that as always being an option. You do not want your seeds to get root bound, because if they do, what happens is the roots run out of room to be able to continue growing, and that can shock your plant or it can kill it. And then we've gone through this whole hassle of starting way ahead of the season for nothing. So definitely watch your plants. You are the judge of how they're growing and how you should be taking care of them. So this is another option if you want to start a whole bunch of seedlings at once. My biggest issue with this is that when it comes time to transplant, you pick out a small clump of seedlings and then you separate them in your hand and you put them in the ground in your garden. And it was just tedious and time consuming to have to pull up a clump and separate them, set them in the ground, and just continually separate them. They separate very, very easily. Onions are the only vegetable that I have ever found that grows so well in close proximity when they're young to something else without intertwining the roots and being able to be pulled apart very easily. So there's very little damage, if any, done to these roots when you're transplanting them. I have never come across a group of onions that is a tangled mess that I can't separate. So if you have the time and the desire and you want to start a whole bunch of seedlings at once, you might want to broadcast them over a flat. A common question I'm also asked is, when is it a good time to set them out? When are they ready to go out? So even if the growing conditions outside are ideal, you want to make sure that your seedlings are strong enough and big enough to be able to handle the transplant. And of course, you still want to harden off your onion plants. So that means setting them outside for gradual periods of time, exposing them to weather outside of their protected environment, starting with an hour or so the first day and gradually increasing that time outdoors until they've been outside for about a week, and then you can leave them outdoors overnight. And just gradually acclimate them to life outside. And that will help drastically reduce any transplant shock also. But the thing with onions is that you want them to be at least the thickness of a pencil. But if you can't get them that big before they go out, the minimum thickness is that you want them to be as thick as the lead inside a pencil. So somewhere between those two visuals, your onions are good to set outside as long as the growing conditions are good. Another question I'm asked is, do you trim your onions? You either can or you don't have to. I personally choose to because I feel these guys just had a haircut yesterday. At least I call it a haircut. They grow nice and strong and they grow straight. And I feel that if I can trim off the top, I just use scissors and I try to get it, as even as I can. I just, turn it on its side and eyeball it as I'm cutting them. Nothing too crazy. But I find that they grow strong and then straight, which is definitely something that you want. But also, if I trim off the wispy bits on the top, they can still be kept close to the light. And I use fluorescent lights, and I'm getting some LED lights to put down here. And it's not something, you don't need grow lights to be able to start seeds. That's another common misconception, a general common misconception. You can just use cheap shop light fixtures and lights. But if you do that, you need to keep your seedlings very close to your light source. Otherwise, they'll reach and they'll get leggy and weak, and you don't want that. But the reason that I trim these, I keep them about 2.5 to 3 inches short, and that allows the main base of the plant to still be close enough to the light to get all the light that the onions need to grow nice and strong. So I will trim them a couple of times, usually every couple of weeks, so it does actually work out to be more than just a couple of times. And then I trim them once more before I put them in the ground, and once they're in the ground, I don't trim them anymore. I make sure that they are kept free of weeds the best I can because they do not like competition from weeds, and I might side dress them with compost depending on how they're looking. But after they're out, I no longer trim them. And I have heard that some people do continue to trim them when they're outside. Reason being, they put that energy into growing a bigger bulb instead of tall leaves. And I would imagine that probably does work. But once they're in the garden, I grow about 5 acres of food. So I try to do as little as possible as far as maintenance care like that on things. I just don't have the time. That and pruning tomatoes. I do not prune my tomatoes. But it can be helpful, especially if you're in a smaller scale and you want great produce and you've got the time, then you might just want to do that. That's on you. But I just thought I would take a couple of minutes. I see we're at 12 minutes, almost 13, so I did not do much better than the last attempt when I got to 16 minutes and I was still talking. So I will end this now, and if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments and I will try to answer them. Talk to you later.